What type of season does AJ Terrell need to have to become the NFL's highest paid corner?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes us your first listen. Shout out to the everydayers. Follow their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are revisiting the 2020 Falcons draft class, not because we're going to give out grades, not because we're going to talk about who we should have taken. We're not going to spend really much time talking about the 2020 draft picks like Marlon Davidson and Sterling Hofrichter that aren't here anymore. We're just talking about the players that the Falcons did take, right? And sort of now that they're essentially all entering contract years, what type of seasons do they need to have in order to maximize their own individual value? Not in this sense of, hey, we need to go back and think about who we should have taken and grading, all that stuff. I don't care about any of that stuff. So let's talk about AJ Terrell, right? And while technically it's not a contract year because he's not going to be a free agent due to the Falcons picking up his 5th-year option last year, but it is kind of a contract year in the sense that this year probably will go a long way to determining what his next contract will be, because the expectation is that next offseason, the Falcons will decide to either extend AJ Terrell or they'll let him play out on that $12.3 million option with the potential of him playing out that year and then deciding on what that second contract is going to be, assuming he doesn't necessarily have the type of year that earns that second contract a year from now. So there's a real high probability or high chance, let's say, maybe not high probability, same thing, but there's a good chance, let's say that that's more accurate, that he could become the highest paid cornerback in the NFL at some point in the next 12 months. And, AJ Terrell's a classic example of a draft pick that was killed at the time, very heavily criticized at the time, not just by Falcon fans. Shout out to Locked On Cowboys co-host Marcus Mosher. But he's absolutely exceeded most of those people's expectations. He's somewhat exceeded my expectations, because let's go back and talk about those by looking at my eye level and ceiling comps for AJ Terrell after that 2020 draft. And my eye level comp was AJ Bouye. My ceiling comp was Darius Slay. And I feel like it's pretty confident to say he's surpassed AJ Bouye, who I saw as like an elite number 2 corner, like the best number 2 corner in the league, is kind of why I made that comp with AJ Terrell. And is approaching Darius Slay level. I don't know if he's quite got there yet. And one of the biggest issues I had with thinking that AJ was going to match or exceed Slay's level is that on-ball production, right? If you look at Darius Slay's time as a starter with the Detroit Lions, which was the case up to that point when I made that comp, he only joined the Eagles, I think, in 2020 and thereafter, right? Darius Slay basically averaged 3 interceptions and 16 pass breakup or past his defense each of those 6 years that he was a starter. And you look at AJ Terrell, he's had a combined total of 4 interceptions across 3 years, 32 pass his defense, which is about 1 interception and 11 passes defense per year. And, basically, that's well behind what Darius Slay had done his first couple of years in the NFL. And you look at AJ Terrell's best year from a production standpoint, which was 2021, he had 3 interceptions, 16 passes defense. So his best year from a production standpoint was an average year for Darius Slay. So that's where that initial expectation of he may not get the on-ball production to get the recognition. And I think that's going to be critical for AJ Terrell, especially this year, in order to merit, the percept to live up to the perception that he is the best cornerback in the league is that on-ball production, right? We talked with Brad Spielberger of PFF earlier this offseason talking about his potential to be the highest paid corner, and Brad basically said he'd be surprised if AJ Terrell does not wind up being the highest paid corner when it is time to come pay him, just because the market needs to be moved forward. And you look at the top 3 highest paid corners in Jair Alexander, Denzel Ward, and Jalen Ramsey. And I think when you look at those guys' production, those guys are kind of routinely averaging like 15, 16 passes defense each and every year. But, I think with, interceptions and pass breakups, right? Like it's kind of like sacks and pressures, right? Like we sit here and say sacks kind of fluctuate year to year. Interceptions are kind of the same way. You kind of have to be more lucky than good to get interceptions in this league, right? Because a lot of interceptions come more in zone coverage than they do in man coverage in this league. And pass breakups tend to be a little bit more consistent year to year, similar to how pressures are more consistent year to year and much more predictive of future success than necessarily looking at interception totals. So with the Falcons moving towards, or the expectation that they'll be moving towards more man coverage, I don't know if AJ Terrell is going to have the opportunities to get a ton of interceptions, although we won't complain if he walks away from the season with 3 or 4 picks this year, but I'm kind of expecting him to get 1 or 2, maybe. We'll see. But like, I don't think that's going to make or break his chances of getting that, big extension. Because you look at Jair Alexander, he's the highest paid corner in the league. And before he got paid in the 4 years that he played, or really 3.5, because he got hurt in one of those years, he only had 5 picks in those years. So he was basically getting 1 and had 1 year of like 2 interceptions. So, the interceptions aren't getting you paid, but, getting those PBUs up, I think will be big for AJ Terrell if he can get in that 15, 16 range. And we'll see if the new supporting cast can help him get there. We're expecting that the presence of Jesse Bates is going to allow AJ Terrell to be more aggressive at the line of scrimmage, take more chances because he knows he has that safety help over the top, and that may allow him to jump more throws and be more aggressive and get some of those pass breakups, at the beginning of plays and whatnot. It'll be interesting to see how the new faces at the right cornerback spot and the nickel cornerback spot potentially, affect AJ Terrell's play, because we've seen in the past where if AJ Terrell's locking down his side of the field, but the other guys aren't, quarterbacks will stop throwing to his side of the field. Because, as we saw last year and previous year with Fabian Moreau and Darren Hall and those guys, if Jeff Okudah, now we expect Jeff Okudah and whoever wins the nickel job, seemingly D. Alford's sort of the front runner there. We expect those guys to be better than their predecessors, but if they're struggling, then, that's less opportunities for AJ Terrell to make plays on the ball. So that'll be interesting to sort of see. But I'm expecting AJ Terrell to have a good year. In fact, I'll probably go on the record at right this point and say I think he'll probably wind up having a Pro Bowl year, because I do expect some of that production to be improved. I also think the fact that the Falcons are going to be a lot more relevant team will allow him to get the recognition that he has not quite gotten outside of, the football junkies, right? The larger public at large doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about AJ Terrell. And so I'm hoping he'll get some of that recognition this year, just because the Falcons as a team are getting more recognition, being, hopefully in the postseason. And, you'll have those announcers talking about, oh, AJ Terrell is, one of the best corners in the business. So, the expectation is he'll get that contract north of $20 million a year, potentially $22, $23 million a year. And of course, because David Mulugeta is his agent, the guaranteed money is going to be critical, right? A big part of that. And you can probably expect that to be in the $75 million range. If Mulugeta is successful in maximizing that guaranteed contract, which presumably will lock AJ Terrell into a contract for the next 3 to 4 years here in Atlanta. So I'm expecting this is only the beginning of a very long career that AJ Terrell has in Atlanta. So looking forward to seeing just how good he's going to be. I'm pretty confident he'll be good this year. It's just a question of, is it 2021 elite, arguably the best cornerback in the league, top 5, whatever you want to call it, or is it 2022 where he's mostly good, but there's a couple of hiccups that prevent you from saying, okay, he's one of the top 5 or 10 corners in the league that season. So that's going to be the question for AJ Terrell. We'll move on and talk about Matt Hennessy, the Falcons' 3rd round pick in that 2020 draft, and whether or not, he's poised to also earn a lucrative contract here in Atlanta or elsewhere next offseason, and whether or not he can fend off Matt Hennessy for that starting left guard spot. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about FanDuel. And while the NBA playoffs may be over, still a great time to head on over to FanDuel because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. And whether you want to bet on next week's NBA draft, you want to bet on the upcoming NFL season, right? Falcons odds to win the NFC South, or Bijan Robinson's odds to win Offensive Player of the Year, right? Or you can bet on Major League Baseball, tennis, golf, volleyball, whatever, Major League Soccer, all of that and more over at America's #1 sports book. So visit fanduel.com/locked on and you'll get your no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's fanduel.com/locked on. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So this is a contract year for Matt Hennessy. And it's kind of similar to the Caleb McGarry situation, where it's kind of a make or break year for him. Now, the biggest difference between Hennessy and McGarry is, unlike McGarry, who was there was no option for the Falcons if McGarry didn't have a breakout year. The Falcons have kind of Hennessy's ready-made replacement, even if he does have a good year or a bad year, ready to go in Matt Bergeron. And, I think it's unlikely that the Falcons bring back Hennessy next year. It's not impossible, right? Because, there's certainly a scenario where he winds up winning the starting left guard spot, plays well as a starter, and, that puts his price range in, probably prices him out of Atlanta because, again, they have that ready-made replacement much cheaper in Bergeron. But I could see Hennessy with a good year playing left guard, and some team deciding, we will try him as our center and has that versatility to also play guard, which only will enhance his market. I could see the floor for Hennessy next offseason being a contract that worth $7 or $8 million and a ceiling maybe in the $12-13 million range. And it's hard to imagine the Falcons paying him that should he have a good year. And in a world where Hennessy starts and doesn't play well, you probably certainly would expect the Falcons to let him walk. And it's basically kind of a narrow bullseye that Hennessy has to hit, right? Like, he has to be good enough to merit the Falcons re-signing him, to justify the Falcons wanting to keep him, but not good enough that another team is going to want to pay him to be their starter. And that's a too narrow a bullseye for me to feel good predicting. Not to mention, even bringing Hennessy back as a backup is probably questionable, given the presence of Javon Gwynn, who, could be that center guard backup or whatever. So we'll just sort of have to see with Hennessy. But I think, for him, whether the team, we'll see. But like for him, obviously his best outcome is winning that starting job. And, while we have since the draft assumed that Matt Bergeron is it's his job to lose at that left guard spot, it's not impossible. Hennessy's been getting the bulk, if not all, of the first team reps this offseason, and probably will get those at least on day one of training camp, presumably. And it'll be kind of interesting to see that dynamic, right? We've seen very different ones, right? Last year at the left guard position, we saw Jalen Mayfield start day one of camp with the starters, and then Elijah Wilkinson on day two got the starting spot and held it down for the rest of the summer. Meanwhile, you look at Hennessy and Drew Dahlman, and basically they were alternating days with the ones, at the center position. And we didn't even know going into the regular season that we assumed it was going to be Drew Dahlman, but we didn't really know until like they announced it like the week before week one of the season that Drew Dahlman was going to be the starter. So, Hennessy was able to take advantage of the opportunities he got last year at that left guard position, started 3 games, was solid in those 3 games, exceeding my expectations. Because if you recall, when we drafted him, I did not see his future as a guard as other people thought. But the fact that he was able to be a pretty functional guard for the Falcons in those 3 starts, is just another feather in the hat of Dwayne Ledford's "I can do no wrong" hat at this point in time, the Falcons offensive line coach. So, the fact that he was able to show that he does have a functional guard skill set, despite not really having the skill set coming out of Temple to show that. And that's going back to the comps I had for him. That was why I gave my eye level comp for him. That was part of the reason why my eye level comp for Hennessy was Chase Roulier. My ceiling comp for him was JC Treader. But Roulier, I noted in that episode, if I recall correctly, that like Roulier started a couple of games at left guard in his second year and was kind of functional at best, but like clearly was not cut out to be a long-term option there. And that's kind of how I felt about Hennessy. But, you know, Hennessy hasn't really quite lived up to those expectations just because he hasn't really gotten the opportunity to flourish as a center. And that's gets us to, you know, why I make these types of player comps when we do these evaluations. And I know a lot of you guys think it's just simply to hedge my bets. And to a certain extent it is, but it is because like there's so many unknowns. Like in the case of Matt Hennessy, in a world, in an alternate universe, right? Locked on multiverse, right? Where the Falcons don't fire Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff in 2020, right? If that regime stays in place, if this team is successful enough for that regime to stay in place, right? The Falcons almost certainly never draft Drew Dalman the following year, and they basically just ride with Matt Hennessy, you know, for the life of his rookie contract. And maybe by this point, we'd be talking about Matt Hennessy with, you know, going into his third year as a starting center, we'd be talking about him reaching that Chase Roulier level with the development that he's got. But of course, you know, in this alternate reality, Chris Morgan is still probably coaching him on the offensive line. So, you know, I can understand being skeptical about that alternate universe when it comes to that. But, you know, that's part of the reason why, you know, projecting these players is so hard, because there's so many unknowns. Who's the coaching staff, right? Coaching changes matter. We'll talk as we talk later when we talk about some of the players that didn't hit in the 2020 draft class, right? We'll talk about injuries, how that affected outcomes. So that's why it's so hard to, and that's why you kind of have to take or at least why I choose to take a more scattershot approach, because you just don't know. But, you know, sitting here today, I would bet on Matt Bergeron being the week one starter at the left guard position, but it wouldn't be the first time that we've had a second round pick of this specific regime with the expectations that they would come in and earn a starting spot that didn't necessarily win that competition in their first training camp. In fact, you know, I think if we go all the way back to 2020 with Marlon Davidson, pretty much none of our second round picks going back. Who was the last 22nd round pick? I'm blanking on who were our 2018 and 2019 second round picks. I'm sure you guys are yelling at your phone. I'll think of it by the end of the episode. But when was the last time we had a second round pick start his rookie year, right? It seems like it's been a while. So we'll see if Matt Bergeron can break that streak or not, or whether Matt Hennessy, you know, is well on his way to earning a lucrative contract here in Atlanta or elsewhere. But I would bet that he'll likely be playing elsewhere this time next year, and we'll just sort of have to see how that breaks down. But we'll continue this 2020 draft conversation, breaking down Michael Walker and Jalen Hawkins as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, I want to give a shout out to my everydayers. And for those of you that will be tuning in to Locked On Falcons for your first listen tomorrow, we will be doing the DeMarco Hellams breakdown, give you my thoughts after going through the film on DeMarco Hellams, all on Locked On Falcons, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So wrapping up today's episode, let's talk about Michael Walker and Jalen Hawkins. And as you recall, if you recall, I wasn't particularly high on either one of those guys that we drafted. I kind of saw both as quote unquote reaches in round 4, because I thought that the Falcons took some late round guys that I considered Walker and Hawkins to be in the 4th round, because they lacked 5th and 6th round picks because of trades that they made earlier that offseason, losing the 5th to, I think, Baltimore in the Hayden Hurst trade, losing the 6th in the Jonathan Cyprien Duke Riley trade, right? You remember that one? You know, so but I think sitting here today, I might have been too low on those guys, you know, while I wouldn't necessarily say that they've exceeded, you know, their ceilings or whatnot, but they've been solid role players, right? They have not been as limited as I thought they would be in their starting roles, right? They're not starters, but, you know, they haven't been like utter disasters, although I'm sure some people might have differing opinion. And my comps for Michael Walker, my eye level comp was Dan Scuda. My ceiling comp was Kamale Correa. For Hawkins, my eye level comp was Sherrod Niesman. And my ceiling comp was Matthias Farley. Now, Walker was drafted to basically be the Devontae Campbell replacement. I didn't necessarily see Walker as a long-term starter. Basically, I said in that episode where I broke him down, I was like, he's the type of guy that starts because you don't have better options. And that to me is exactly what happened in 2022. The Falcons didn't have a better option than Michael Walker. And so he started at linebacker last year. And he was one of those players that a lot of people discussed as a potential breakout candidate given how good a summer he did. He didn't necessarily do that, but it was interesting because like Walker was this kind of proxy battlefront in the Deion Jones war last year. It was interesting to me because just to and this speaks of sort of what expectations are, right? Like, because it felt like there were some people that were very anti Deion Jones that kind of built up Michael Walker to be more than what he was, and then you had the opposite side of the coin that whether it was pro Deion Jones people or because certain people were building up Michael Walker when he didn't live up to those expectations, they kind of treated him like he was terrible. And the truth to me was somewhere in the middle. He was fine. He was okay as a starter. He's kind of the ideal backup. You're a capable special teams guy, versatility and experience playing multiple linebacker spots, a good enough athlete to be capable in coverage. The tackling needs to be much better. That's been the one through line with him. He's not a great open field tackler, but that's still he checks a lot of the boxes that if you're drawing up exactly what you want in an ideal backup linebacker, Michael Walker kind of fits the bill in that regard. So it'll be interesting to see what type of year he has. It makes sense for the Falcons to keep him if he continues to show that he's a capable backup. But at the same time, he's the type of player that it wouldn't shock me if the Falcons felt like they could replace with a day 3 draft selection. And it's kind of interesting going back to the 2020 draft where the Falcons left those 5th and 6th round picks, similar to this past year. Like if they had one of those picks, potentially they would have drafted Michael Walker's replacement this year. And we'd be talking about him in the similar way of Matt Hennessy, where it seems like they're ready to push him out the door. But we'll see. I think this year Walker's chances of coming back are iffy, right? But I think he increases those chances if he proves to be very valuable in special teams and or gets an opportunity to kind of be a fill-in starter and plays with a little bit more consistency than he has shown to date. And that could justify the Falcons offering him a second contract. But at the same time, again, that type of player that we're talking about, theoretically, you feel pretty confident that you can find that type of linebacker on day 3 of the draft. So it would also make sense for the Falcons to just, cut the cord and move on and find a cheaper option than paying the veteran price that Walker would have in free agency. Now, talking about Jalen Hawkins, he was basically drafted to be the backup to Keanu Neal, given his injury history at that point. And what I will say about Jalen Hawkins is he's been better in coverage than I thought he would be, right? But he hasn't really been that sort of enforcer type in run support. I expected him really to kind of be more of a special teams guy, and he's been solid there, nothing special there. But he's kind of found a role as a potential third safety this year. That's kind of the expectation for him this year. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not he lives up or exceeds those expectations as being a very capable backup this year as that third safety, right? We kind of hoped that he would be maybe more than that last year as a starter. He wasn't. Similar, like you're starting Jalen Hawkins because you don't have better options, not because Jalen Hawkins is an ideal starter for you in this league. But while I wouldn't say he's exceeded my expectations, I tend to have a little bit more of a favorable opinion of Jalen Hawkins, relatively speaking. The comp I had for him was Matthias Farley for his ceiling comp, and I feel like they're roughly the same. Farley I thought was a really good backup, but Farley was more of that enforcer type at the strong safety position. And as I said, Hawkins hasn't really been that guy, but I think he's kind of made up for it with being a little bit better in coverage, certainly better than Farley was, and better than I thought he would be in the NFL. And, obviously similar to with the situation with Hennessy, you feel like the Falcons have already made replacement with the DeMarco Hellams draft selection. And we'll talk about this probably on tomorrow's episode, but Hellams to me more fits that style of like the cover 3 backup corner. Safety, behind Keanu Neal. Like if we could flip, we could time travel, kidnap DeMarco Hellams, put him in the 2020 draft, that would have been a better fit for that style of defense that we played. But we'll go deeper into that on tomorrow's episode. So we'll see, what Hawkins does this year, right? I would sit here and say he probably has a greater chance of sticking and being kept by the Falcons next year when he hits the market than say a Michael Walker, because presumably if the Falcons follow the Saints blueprint under new defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen, and the Saints have been one of the teams that use a lot more dime than most teams, that basically makes the third safety, in this case, Jalen Hawkins, the 13th starter on defense, right? Some of you are like, why 13 and not the 12th? The 12th starter is the nickel corner. The 13th starter is, that dime safety. And so there's greater opportunity for for Jalen Hawkins to prove himself to be a more essential component of this defense, even if he is just a role player / backup for this team, right? They can see him as he's a very good third safety, right? That could be the conclusion at the end of the season. Not to mention, the addition of Jesse Bates, theoretically, with Hawkins in that third safety role, where he won't be asked to be playing sort of that single high safety that he was kind of stuck playing last year. He'll be a lot more aggressive playing closer to the line of scrimmage because of Bates can sort of cover up those issues at the center fielder position. And that may allow him to blossom into being more of that enforcer type that I thought he would be coming into the league. So we'll just sort of have to see. But of the non-AJ Terrell 2020 draft pick still in the Falcons roster, I would probably bet the most money on Hawkins being here in 2024 over Hennessy and Walker. But again, sitting here today, I would not say that is a likely outcome just because of my expectations for DeMarco Hellams to kind of be slotted into that role, but we'll just sort of have to see. Now, if you're curious what my comps were for the 2020 draft picks, Marlon Davidson and Sterling Hoffrichter, that are no longer on the Falcons, Marlon Davidson never got above his floor of Mario Edwards, right? And mostly due to injuries, just not allowing him to play enough football for us to see him be more than that. The potential was there, but we just never got that opportunity. My eye level comp for him was Malik Collins. My ceiling comp was Matt Ioannidis. Unfortunately, did not live to that. But again, I don't feel bad about those projections just because I think injuries just completely derailed his career. And it's a similar story for Sterling Hoffrichter. I didn't have a ceiling comp for him because it's like, how can I come up with 3 punters to compare a player to? I just came up with one, and that was Thomas Morstead, our Lord and Savior. But similarly, Hoffrichter got derailed by injuries. And, those two guys illustrate why the draft is such a crapshoot and why projecting these players is just, you're just throwing darts at a board, because it's like, you just don't know. We could be sitting here 3 years from now talking about, Bijan Robinson or Zach Harrison and be like, yeah, they never lived up to their expectations because they were hurt every year. That's just the nature of football, and we'll just sort of see. But it's unfortunate. There's still a part of me that's like, we still should have kept Sterling Hoffrichter, because I feel like he'd be doing just as much as what Bradley Pinion is doing. But again, I'll leave that for Locked On Multiverse to explore that alternate reality. But that's our 2020 draft review. We'll probably talk a little bit more as the summer unfolds about some of those 2021 draft picks going into that quote unquote critical third year as well, to sort of revisit some of those projections as well later this summer as well. But you can check out the DeMarco Hellams breakdown on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Falcons as your first listen, and continue to check out your Locked On NFL podcast as your second listen. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every